If you want to understand international politics today, it's important to analyze how warfare has changed in recent history. There are some people who claim that in the 21st century, there have been fewer wars than in the 20th century and previous centuries. However, that misunderstands how war has evolved. With the creation of nuclear weapons and other technologies, it is now more dangerous to wage conventional war with militaries of different states fighting each other. So instead, in the past several decades, war has become more and more unconventional. Governments and non-state actors use other forms of war, including psychological war, information war, technological war and cyber war, and of course, economic war. And the United States in particular has become the master of economic war. The Washington Post calculated that the US government has imposed sanctions on 1/3 of all of the countries on Earth, including 60% of low-income nations, especially in Eurasia and Africa. By the way, pretty much all of those sanctions are illegal under international law. They are considered unilateral coercive measures. But because the US is an empire, a global hegemon, there are no consequences when it constantly violates international law and wages economic war against countries all around the world. And sometimes Western defenders of sanctions claim that supposedly sanctions are non-violent. They're a peaceful form of pressure that Western governments can take. That is absolutely not true. This is war by other means. In fact, sanctions often lead to even more deaths than conventional military war. A peer-reviewed study published in the leading medical journal, The Lancet, in 2025 by leading scholars found that economic sanctions imposed by the USA or the European Union were associated with more than 560,000 deaths per year on average from 1971 until 2021. That is 500,000 deaths on average per year over 50 years. We're talking about tens of millions of deaths caused by these illegal Western sanctions. Sanctions are not peaceful. They're not an alternative to war. I repeat, they are another form of war that can be just as deadly, if not more so. And of course, one of the main targets of this aggressive U.S. economic warfare is Iran. The U.S. government, for years, not just under Trump, has tried to crush the Iranian economy in order to destabilize and overthrow the Iranian government. However, although this U.S. economic war against Iran is bipartisan, that is true. We saw that the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration imposed very aggressive sanctions against Iran. With all of that said, the Trump administration, both in its first term and now in its second term, has taken this economic war against Iran to a whole new level. Trump declared what he called a maximum pressure campaign to try to destroy the Iranian economy. And Trump's Undersecretary of State, Jacob Hellberg, who is a neoconservative warmonger, boasted on Twitter that, quote, President Trump's strategy of maximum pressure has brought the regime to its knees, end quote. And as the U.S. is dropping economic bombs on Iran's economy, Trump is threatening to drop physical bombs to bomb Iran again, just as he attacked Iran in June 2025. And Trump claims that these new bombings, these new airstrikes will be, quote, far worse, end quote. Back in June 2025, when Trump bombed Iran, he openly called for regime change. And he's been promoting this slogan, Make Iran Great Again, MAGA. And then more recently, in January 2026, as Iranians were protesting in the streets, Trump openly supported them as they were burning down government buildings. And he wrote on his social media website, Truth Social, quote, Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions, help is on its way, MAGA, end quote. In January, Trump also boasted that he sent a, quote, massive armada, end quote, of U.S. military forces to the Middle East, to West Asia, to surround Iran, to prepare for a conventional war. And let's not forget that these threats came just a few weeks after Trump bombed Venezuela and kidnapped Venezuela's internationally recognized president, Nicolas Maduro. The New York Times created a map showing where some of the U.S. military forces in the region are, including 2 U.S. destroyers, which are next to the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the most important geostrategic choke points on Earth. Millions of barrels of oil travel through that very small choke point every day. There are also 3 combat ships off the coast of Iran, as well as in the Arabian Sea. The USS Lincoln, an aircraft carrier, has been deployed along with 3 more destroyers, in addition to a U.S. guided missile destroyer near the Suez Canal, another very important geostrategic choke point off the coast of Egypt, and then 2 more U.S. destroyers in the Mediterranean off the coast of Lebanon. The U.S. empire has also surrounded Iran with dozens of military bases in the region and at least 40,000 U.S. troops, especially in some of the Gulf monarchies like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. So if Trump bombs Iran again, it's very possible this could spread into a regional war, given that Iran has made it clear that it will retaliate in self-defense against this U.S. war of aggression and could potentially hit U.S. military bases and troops stationed in the dozens of bases surrounding it in the region. So this is a very dangerous moment that could grow into a large conventional military war. But today I'm going to be focusing on something related but slightly different, which is the economic war that the U.S. has been waging against Iran. Because top Trump administration officials have been boasting that they are trying to collapse Iran's economy. That was the language used by Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who is a billionaire hedge fund manager from Wall Street. In an interview on Fox News, Scott Bessent boasted that the so-called maximum pressure campaign of brutal U.S. sanctions on Iran collapsed Iran's economy. By the way, these U.S. sanctions are completely illegal according to international law. Bessent also sadistically gloated about the fact that Iran is running out of dollars, which has led to significant inflation, and Iran cannot pay for imports, which has caused an economic crisis, which is why people are protesting. So when you listen to this clip here, keep in mind, this is a top U.S. government official boasting of collapsing Iran's economy and taking credit for the protests. So this is clearly the intention. The U.S. wants to destabilize the government, and the U.S. is supporting these protests that it started in the first place. Listen here.
What do you want to say about sanctions, something else you've been working on, of course? What are you planning there in terms of Iran and the impact there? Do sanctions actually work? And the same question with regard to 500% secondary sanctions or tariffs on countries who purchase energy products from Russia.
Okay, so two things there. There are Treasury sanctions. And if you look at a speech that I gave at the Economic Club of New York last March, I said that I believe the Iranian currency was on the verge of collapse, that if I were an Iranian citizen, I would take my money out. President Trump ordered Treasury and our OFAC division, Office of Foreign Asset Control, to put maximum pressure on Iran, and it's worked. Because in December, their economy collapsed. We saw a major bank go under. The central bank has started to print money. There is a dollar shortage. They are not able to get imports. And this is why the people took to the street. So this is economic statecraft. No shots fired.
Now, that Fox News interview is from January 2026. And in that segment, Scott Bessent mentioned a speech that he delivered at the Economic Club of New York in March 2025. In those remarks, the U.S. Treasury Secretary admitted that the Trump administration's so-called maximum pressure campaign on Iran was, quote, designed to collapse its already buckling economy, end quote. Listen here, where a top US official admits they are trying to collapse Iran's economy, and he takes credit for destroying the Iranian currency, the rial, by starving Iran of hard currency, leading to very high rates of inflation.
Last month, the White House announced its maximum pressure campaign on Iran, designed to collapse its already buckling economy. The Iranian economy is in disarray. 35% official inflation has official inflation, a currency that has depreciated 60% in the last 12 months, and an ongoing energy crisis. I know a few things about currency devaluations, and if I were an Iranian, I would get all of my money out of the rial now.
In the speech that Scott Bessent gave at the Economic Club of New York, he admitted that the Trump administration's so-called maximum pressure campaign is designed to collapse Iran's oil exports, to shut down the country's oil sector, and to prevent Iran from accessing the international financial system.
We will close off Iran's access to the international financial system by targeting regional parties that facilitate the transfer of its revenues. Our maximum pressure campaign, designed to collapse Iranian oil exports, we are going to shut down Iran's oil sector.
And because the United States is at the center of the international financial system and the US dollar is the global reserve currency, this makes US sanctions particularly devastating, very painful, especially for small and medium-sized countries. Now, there are large countries, superpowers like China and Russia, that have shown that they are basically too big to sanction, if you will. But US sanctions on smaller countries, relatively, like Cuba and Venezuela and Iran, have been extremely destructive because these countries are not big enough to develop their own alternative financial structure. China and the BRICS countries are slowly, gradually trying to develop an alternative international financial infrastructure, but that's going to take decades. Iran, meanwhile, has been suffering under these suffocating sanctions. And by the way, what's even more sadistic about this is that top US government officials have been gloating about the economic harm they're causing to the Iranian people. In his speech at the Economic Club of New York, Scott Bessent said that the goal of the US is, quote, making Iran broke again.
Making Iran broke again will mark the beginning of our updated sanctions policy.
And when the US Treasury Secretary joked that they're trying to make Iran broke again, you could hear these Wall Street executives all applauding and clapping in joy. And behind Scott Bessent on stage was sitting Stephen Schwarzman, the billionaire oligarch who's the CEO of Blackstone, the largest alternative asset manager on earth, which has a massive private equity arm. Blackstone, by the way, is the largest landlord in the United States. This Wall Street firm owns more than 300,000 rental housing units in the US. And it's not a coincidence that this billionaire oligarch, Stephen Schwarzman, was one of the main funders of Donald Trump's presidential campaign. So it's obvious that the Trump administration's policies are designed in order to serve the economic interests of these big capitalist oligarchs, these billionaires, robber barons from Wall Street. They're not even hiding it. I mean, Scott Bessent himself is a billionaire who is a hedge fund manager on Wall Street. And Bessent's admission that the US government is intentionally trying to cause hyperinflation in Iran to collapse the economy, those remarks are extremely revealing. Because when you listen to the Western media, they constantly blame the high rates of inflation in Iran on corruption and mismanagement. And obviously, yes, there's corruption in every country on earth, including, by the way, there's a ton of corruption in the US government, but that's an issue for another video. Of course, there's also mismanagement in many countries, especially when you're under sanctions, when you're under siege, and you have economic crises. So you have a lot of brain drain. So a lot of technocrats in Iran have immigrated. They've left the country. People who are skilled in engineering and have a medical background and scientists, they often leave the country. This is a common problem, brain drain, in many global South nations. But in the case of Iran, it's obvious that the main cause of the high rates of inflation are the illegal U.S. sanctions that have been imposed on Iran. If you look at recent inflation data, it's true that inflation has been very high, of 40 to 50%. But what's interesting is if you go back to 2016 and 17 into 2018, inflation was relatively quite low. And why is that? It's because in 2015, the U.S. signed the Iran nuclear deal with Iran, and the U.S. lifted the illegal sanctions that it had imposed. However, Trump then unilaterally withdrew the U.S. from this agreement in 2018 during his first term as U.S. president. This was a blatant violation of international law because the Iran nuclear deal had originally been agreed to by the Barack Obama administration and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union. All of these major countries signed the Iran nuclear deal, and it was written into international law with the UN Security Council resolution. And then Trump came into power in his first term, and in 2018, he unilaterally tore up that agreement, and he illegally imposed sanctions on Iran. And this was part of the U.S. empire's so-called maximum pressure campaign to try to destabilize the Iranian government. And now in Trump's second term, you have the U.S. Undersecretary of State admitting that this strategy of maximum pressure has brought the so-called regime to its knees. And this caused inflation in Iran to skyrocket. It's not a coincidence that if you look at some of the countries with the highest rates of inflation on earth, many of them have been sanctioned by the United States and the West more broadly, including Iran, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Sudan. Now, in the case of Argentina, Argentina has tons and tons of debt denominated in US dollars owed primarily to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So it has to print money in order to pay this debt owed to the US-dominated IMF. It's not sanctions, but the point is that many countries that are suffering from hyperinflation or high rates of inflation are also suffering from US sanctions. That's not a coincidence. And if you look at the inflation rates in Iran over time, I'm using data here from the World Bank, you can see a very interesting trend. In the 2000s, before the US massively escalated its sanctions on Iran, the inflation rate was relatively low. But then it rose significantly after the George W. Bush administration imposed sanctions on Iran in 2006. And then Barack Obama came in office in 2009, and inflation was temporarily at a low of 10% in 2010. But then suddenly, inflation skyrocketed over the next 3 years, rising to 37% in 2013. So what happened that caused this inflation to suddenly skyrocket again in Iran, to increase by more than 3 times in a few years? Well, in 2010, the Obama administration imposed very aggressive sanctions on Iran. And in 2012, the Obama White House published a press release, a completely sadistic document boasting of how devastating its sanctions were. Obama bragged that, quote, Iran is under greater pressure than ever before. Few thought that sanctions could have an immediate bite on the Iranian regime. They have, slowing the Iranian nuclear program and virtually grinding the economy to a halt in 2011. And in 2012, the Iranian government faces the prospect of even more crippling sanctions, end quote. So again, it's not surprised that after the Obama administration imposed these sanctions on Iran, inflation suddenly skyrocketed. But then what happened in 2014 is the US and Iran negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, which was signed in 2015. And then in the next few years, inflation once again fell to a low of 7% in 2016, which not coincidentally was the year after Iran and the US and other countries signed the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and the US and Europe lifted their illegal sanctions against Iran. The economy stabilized and inflation fell to a very low level. But then what happened in 2018? Trump came in his first term, and he illegally tore up the Iran nuclear deal, and then inflation once again skyrocketed. And those sanctions, these illegal U.S. sanctions on Iran, continued in the Joe Biden administration, and the Iranian economy has continued to suffer from very high rates of inflation. That's not a coincidence. As Scott Bessent himself admitted, this is the intended impact of these illegal sanctions to crush the Iranian economy.
The White House announced its maximum pressure campaign on Iran, designed to collapse its already buckling economy.
And this is not new. This is not only against Iran. Of course, the illegal U.S. sanctions on Iran go back many decades to the victory of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. But you can go back even further to 1960, a year after the people of Cuba overthrew a U.S.-backed puppet dictator, a right-wing regime that was extremely corrupt and worked with the mafia. And the Cuban people, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, had a revolution. And then in 1960, the U.S. State Department discussed plans to try to destabilize Cuba's new revolutionary government. In a declassified U.S. State Department cable, top U.S. officials admitted that the majority of Cubans supported Castro and the new revolutionary government, and there was no effective political opposition. Therefore, they concluded, quote, "The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship," end quote. These top U.S. officials then openly admitted what the goal was of the sanctions and the blockade that they illegally put on Cuba over 60 years ago. And still today, the U.S. is trying to economically suffocate Cuba. They wrote, quote, "Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, to make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government," end quote. That's the money quote. To bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. That's the stated intention of sanctions. And this is what's happening today in Iran and in Cuba and in Venezuela. These countries that the U.S. empire has tried to crush with illegal sanctions to destroy the economy, to try to overthrow the government. Again, it's not a coincidence that the U.S. started backing these violent riots to bring about regime change in Iran at the same time as the Trump administration bombed Venezuela and kidnapped President Maduro. As Al Jazeera pointed out, and Al Jazeera, which is Qatari state media, it is not friendly to Iran. It has often been very critical of Iran. But Al Jazeera pointed out, quote, "Decades of U.S.-led sanctions against Iran, including ones that were toughened under President Trump, have played a central role in Iran's economic crises," end quote. And by the way, what's so sadistic about the Trump administration is it has publicly claimed that supposedly its sanctions are supporting the courageous people of Iran. On the 15th of January, the U.S. State Department published an outrageous press release claiming that its sanctions are supporting the Iranian people, not mentioning that these sanctions are responsible for the economic crisis in Iran in large part. Again, I'm not saying it's the only factor, but it's by far the most important factor. And this is exactly what independent experts on international law at the United Nations have been saying for many years. If you look at the office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, you can see on their website they have published many reports detailing how U.S. sanctions are illegal. They violate international law and they violate human rights of people. This 2019 report noted that, quote, "An independent expert appointed by the Human Rights Council has expressed deep concern at the recent imposition of unilateral coercive measures on Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran by the United States, saying the use of economic sanctions for political purposes violates human rights and the norms of international behavior, Such action may precipitate man-made humanitarian catastrophes of unprecedented proportions. Regime change through economic measures are likely to lead to the denial of basic human rights and indeed possibly to starvation, end quote. That UN report was published in 2019 during Trump's first term, but under Joe Biden, the Democrat, the US still did not lift the illegal unilateral sanctions that Trump had imposed on Iran, because this is bipartisan. Imperialism is bipartisan in Washington. And in 2022, during the Biden administration, the UN published another report stating very clearly that these illegal US sanctions violate the human rights of all Iranians and devastate the Iranian economy. So when you see Western government officials claim that we should do something to help the people of Iran, as the US politician Andrew Yang said, keep in mind that the best thing that the Western powers could do, especially the US, to actually help the people of Iran is to lift the illegal sanctions that they have imposed on Iran, which violate the human rights of people in Iran and are responsible for economic crises and the suffering of millions of civilians. That would be a tangible, realistic policy that would actually help the people of Iran and the people of Venezuela and Cuba and other countries targeted by the US empire. But if you study the history of US imperialism, you would know that the US empire doesn't actually care about human rights and certainly does not care about democracy. The US empire has been the main violator of the human rights of the Iranian people and the Venezuelan people and the Cuban people, and the list goes on and on. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.